Hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm here to talk about creating sample code. Um, Before I get too deep into this talk, please let me know if this inspires you to create anything. My Twitter handle is at Jessica Garson. And if you're building any sample code, if you want to show me some sample code that you're writing, if you want any advice or suggestions or want to talk about this talk, happy to talk with you whenever. My DMs are open, and it's at Jessica Garson. And I'm a developer advocate at Twitter, and we were launching a new set of products about a year ago. And that was Twitter Developer Labs. And you can find out more about that at t.co/labs. But basically, we were releasing a series of previews of new endpoints for developers to connect to. And we were partnering closely with developers to help and to help create and shape the future of our API. This is kind of where we started the process of rebuilding the Twitter API as well. And so with this is actually the first time I kind of got into writing sample code. Previously, before coming to Twitter, I was an educator, and I was teaching a class at NYU and things like that. But, I had never created new sample code for a launch. And so it was really an interesting challenge because they were new endpoints that no one had ever built with before. And you might be wondering, so what is sample code? Sample code is code for others to use. So I like to think about it as code for other humans. With that, it is code that might be on a tutorial. It could be in an educational resource like a video. It could be code that is, live coded on a talk. It could be code that is in, a sample code in a quick start guide. It could be code that lives in documentation. Sample code comes in many different shapes and sizes, but it is code to help you accomplish a goal, and really code that helps to get you started just a little bit quicker. And it's very different from production code where, it has to kind of live in a production code base with, so that others can extend and add new features to an application. It's, similar in the fact that others should be able to extend it and build, features that they want on top of it. But it might not necessarily be your coworkers that you can just send a Slack message to. It could be, many different developers. So it's code that is, supposed to be a resource. And so Twitter sample code can be found on our GitHub repository at github.com/twitterdev. We also have it sprinkled throughout our quick start guides and our documentation as well. And when I think about sample code in particular, I also kind of think about code-related resources. And so, with this launch, we launched a series of code-related resources as well. So we added a Postman collection. And Postman, for those who don't know, is a REST client that helps you make your first, or helps you make a HTTP request. And it kind of gives you kind of an environment where you can type the URL in, and then you can kind of adjust the parameters and adjust the URL and see what data comes back and kind of play with it in an iterative fashion, kind of like you would for code. And a collection is a series of pre-made requests. So for these new labs endpoints, we had a series of pre-made requests that kind of to help get you started. And this was a feature that people had asked for a long time. So we were really excited to finally be able to give this as well. And so you might not think about this as a code sample, but it is, because it's a starting point to connect you to API. And we also made available our open API specification as well too. So that was something that was really exciting. This is the first time that we kind of peeled back this layer of transparency and kind of let folks see what you can do with our endpoints in this way. So really excited about launching our first open API specification with the labs launch, and expanding upon that in the past year as well. And so, you know, if you are going to be creating sample code, which I hope a lot of people watching this talk will have the opportunity to do, you know, as I create sample code and code related resources and things like that, I kind of ask myself a lot of questions. So, the first thing that I really like to think about is, can you look at the code and know what's going on? Readability is so important when you're creating sample code. Code should be consistent. And what that means is, you know, let's say you have a code sample that's supposed to hit the same endpoint in two languages, JavaScript and Python. Your JavaScript version of the code should, you know, have roughly the same logic, similar libraries, similar flow as the Python version, and vice versa. Also, the code should be commented as well, but not too commented. And you might be wondering, like, what does that mean? I personally am a fan of lightly commented code. I've seen some code that has, you know, maybe like 13, 14 paragraphs full of, you know, directions and things like that. And especially if you're looking at code, you want to be able to like look at it, try to figure out what's going on as quickly as possible. And so really trying to like, you know, take a look at that and be like, oh, cool. Right. All right, cool. Like that is something that is really, you know, good to know. Like having key instructions be comments is a good rule of thumb, but like anything more than that tends to, I think, kind of take away from the code sample as well and make it a little bit harder to read. Also having a good Readme as well. So, you know, having a Readme that explains everything that you need to get set up, tells you, you know, what versions of libraries you're using, really any like setup directions that you need. But again, you know, don't fall into the same trap as code comments. Readme that is too long can also take away from it as well. So you really want to strive to be able to kind of like have you know, your Readme just be a helpful resource as well, especially if you're using like a GitHub repository for you to host your sample code. The other thing to kind of think about is function names. Like, is it, you know, very short and to the point? Also, but not like, you know, too short where it's just like, you know, one letter, which I've done that before, and that's definitely not a good practice for creating sample code. Also, same thing with variable names, trying to make them as descriptive as possible, avoiding, you know, one letter variable names as well too. And, you know, sometimes I have been known to do that and then have a function name that's really descriptive as well too. So that's kind of a way to kind of like mitigate it if you do that. But like, you know, really just trying to make sure that you could look at your code and see what's happening and that it's very concise and descriptive at the same time. So the next question I like to ask myself too as I'm building sample code is like, can I build on top of it? And so recently I was writing some code, or had to write a code sample for a talk I was giving at the Philly Python user group. And I hadn't built off of our new filtered stream sample that we had just released. And filtered stream is an endpoint that lets you create a rule and you can get back a real-time stream of tweets that matches that rule. And so I was using that as like a demo for the meetup. And instead of, you know, building my own logic and connection to the endpoint, I actually decided to use our Python sample that we had in the world and build on top of it and extend it and, you know, get it to form into the application that I wanted to present. And it was a really interesting learning experience. Really helped me kind of build more developer empathy, just as I was, you know, building with that as well. So, you know, that's definitely something to consider, is like thinking about your code sample that you're building kind of as like Lego blocks, and like building on top of that as well can be really helpful. So yeah, recommend anybody who's writing sample code to try to like build on top of it too. And then the other thing, you know, that I really like to think about as well is like, how will others perceive your code samples? on the team that I'm on, we spend a lot of time editing written documents, and we're just starting the process of moving more towards giving the same attention to our code samples as well. So, thinking about things like, do you use a code linter? And, that's something that we have been moving more towards. One of the things that personally, when I see code samples that are in documentation and things like that, and I open it up in my editor and I see, my editor, which has a lot of linters that I've already customized, light up like a Christmas tree. I always kind of it's like nails on a chalkboard to me. So, really, are you using linters? What linters are you using? Are you documenting that anywhere as well too? And then also, are you following code conventions? Are you, for example, I tend to use an auto formatter that kind of helps me make sure that my code is following Python conventions. I use Black as the auto formatter, which is really exciting for me. I love auto formatters. Happy to talk to anybody about that whenever. But I tend to use Black for that as well, and I feel like it gives my code just a little bit more polish as well. And then, the other thing is making sure that you're not using libraries with security vulnerabilities, that you're not using libraries that are deprecated, things like that. Really trying to make sure that your code samples are as polished as possible, and that you are following, the conventions and specifications that are really, language specific as well for whatever language that you're writing. And then the other thing to think about as well too is, and this might seem very obvious and silly, but it's something to consider, which is does it work? The code doesn't always age so well, and this is something that, especially in the past year, kind of supporting labs code, it's really interesting how many times it breaks. I'm just oh, wow, okay, that doesn't work. That's deprecated now. Cool, great, all right. A lot of tutorials that I've run into tend to be aged. So making sure that, as endpoints are changing, especially with labs, which were experimental endpoints that, we documented that, they would change, and they did change throughout the year, making sure that the code is working and that you're checking it every so often. Also making sure that the code can easily be ran without a complicated setup, that all the libraries that you say that you need to install, you do need to install, making sure that it's aging well, and that you can also extend it and quickly make changes if things do change, and making sure it's not so complicated that you can't change it as things change. So making sure that your code is working is something, and also, testing it with people with a wide variety of backgrounds also really kind of, if everybody can run the same code, then that's great. We recently actually, for some new code samples we were looking at, we actually did a bug bash, which is, our engineering teams tend to do this, which is, we have a series of tests and everybody tries to replicate, and we try to have 2 testers per each test. And, we really tried to make sure that we were kind of giving our sample code the same sort of attention as we do major engineering releases and things like that too. So having that bug bash on sample code was something that was really fun and exciting, and it was really cool to kind of see that happen. And I think that that's a really great idea that, I hope that we do this more often as well too. So you might be wondering at this point, so what exactly does good sample code look like? To me, I have a very personal style of writing code. I tend to have it be very clean and very modular. And I like to think about my functions as paragraphs. One of the things that I do is I write out, all the steps that I need to take, and then I turn each of the steps into a function, and, think about it in that way. And so, that's something that's really fun for me. So let me show you an example, that I did recently for a sentiment example. So, I have this is some Python code that I wrote, and I have the imports up at the top, from there, the first thing that you have to do kind of when you're hitting a new endpoint is you need to hit the URL. So we want to create the URL, and this code sample allows you to obtain a sentiment score for your own handle. So again, my Twitter handle is Jessica Garson, and then I had this YAML configuration file that had some of my secrets, and so I needed to grab out my bearer token from that configuration file, and then from there I needed to authenticate and connect to the Twitter API. I needed to shape some data, and I needed to connect to Azure, create a header, and there were lots of different steps. But I kind of like to think about it as if I was writing the tutorial before I even wrote the tutorial, as I was writing the code, and that was just a really fun way of writing the code. And it really kind of helped me kind of create a more modular framework as well. So yeah, that was something that was really exciting as I was writing that. Also, just making sure that it's simple and to the point. For example, I was writing some code that used the lab's recent search endpoint in Python, but running it in R with this package called Reticulate as a tutorial, and I've also given it as a talk as well. But this example originally started as 120 lines, and then I just kept on removing lines. I almost felt like a slasher, just removing lines that didn't need to be there, until I had a very short sample. I think this ended up being 35 lines. So there were some breaks and some things, but I really wanted to make it as simple and as to the point, and just thinking about it from an editorial perspective, how can I make this as short, as easy to understand as possible, so I can live code it at a conference, so I can live code it at a meetup, really making it simple, to the point, easy to understand, and short. And so, not adding any unnecessary complexity, and really just asking myself as I went along, does every line actually need to be there? And in many cases, it doesn't. On the same token, making sure it's not too long. You can always break up code if you need to. And you can always also provide resources of where to extend your code sample as well. So I had a code sample that used Labs Recent Search again. And Labs Recent Search delivers tweets from the past 7 days. And with that, I used to have a car in New York City, and so I wanted to send myself a text message every time I didn't need to move my car, because I was moving my car too much. It was a whole thing. And so this code sample originally was I think it was about 60, 70 lines. I try not to go more than 45 lines. So I was okay, cool. How can I break this up? So you can see here, I import in from Twilio Connect, and I import in Twilio Connect and send message. And so this file called twilioconnect.py has the Twilio helper functions. And then I import that into my main parking.py file. And that's something that you can always do, especially if your code sample is getting really long. I'd rather have lots of short code samples than one long, hard to read code sample. So that's just some examples to kind of illustrate what good code looks like. So at Twitter, the process that we use for writing sample code is pretty simple. Also, if you have a process that works really well for you and your team, please let me know. Basically, we start with creating code. And then, I like to kind of start with a notebook and think about all the steps and then build it from there. And that, I think, tends to be a very user-friendly way to build code. And then we have peer review. I tend to be very specific about who I look for, especially as I'm okay, so I think about the objective of the code sample that I'm building. And then I'm okay, so who on the team is the best person to review this? And I tend to have it be people from diverse perspectives. So often I'll look for somebody who's brand new in a language. I've even gone so far as to have very brand new programmers run my code for the first time. And I'm okay, cool, does this work for you? And walk them through it. Sometimes with being on the same Google Hangouts is something that I've done in the past too. But also someone who's super experienced, someone who really knows the endpoint really well. Really just trying to be very specific. And I even like write like long emails to people before with like a series of questions to think about, as they're reviewing the code, giving like directions for reviewing the code, and giving people things to think about and like what can be made better. One of the questions I often ask is like, what is unnecessary, what isn't needed here, and really like making sure that everyone has like a series of questions to ask while they're reviewing my code really helps make my code as good as possible, I think. Also iterating, like taking that feedback, listening to it, and then rebuilding the code, and then actually building on top of the code, similar to what I did with filtered stream, like trying to build an example and extend it as well, really helps gets me to a really good place as well. And then getting community feedback as well is really helpful. Like if things aren't working, we tend to find out pretty quickly. And so really, taking that and making those changes as quickly as possible and being very receptive to feedback as well. So during this process, I've learned a lot of new things. Most notably, one of the things that I learned is the importance of Hello World. So Hello World is the first program that a programmer tends to write in a new language or with like a new API, and really like thinking about it, it's like, okay, how can I help somebody get to Hello World as quickly as possible as you're writing code, is something that's like really fun and important to do. So really trying to make sure that, you have that come up. The first time that I wrote with the Twitter API, I was so excited. Like I sent an email to like an email list of like, a lot of people. And so I think there were like 2,000 people on this like email list of people who were like learning how to code in the DC area at the same time that I was, through this program called Hear Me Code, which was like beginner friendly classes for women by women. And I sent them an email being like, I just wrote a Twitter bot. I'm so excited. And like sent my GitHub repo. And it was like super simple, but I was so excited that I wanted to tell everybody that I did it. And so, trying to like have as many people replicate that experience as possible is something that is important to kind of think about. Also, what is good today might not be good tomorrow. So really like making sure that, your code is aging well, that, there's no security vulnerabilities, so you're quickly fixing that you're, updating it as endpoints change, as code conventions change, as you learn about new things, and really having it be, something that's living, that you update and change regularly, is something that, you want to think about as well. It's pretty crazy that even like, I think about a lot of the code I built even in the past year, a lot of it is outdated now, that I built this time last year. So, think about that as you are creating code samples as well. Also consider accessibility. Your code will be viewed by people from many different backgrounds, from many different places. And so really trying to kind of be sure that you can reach them, really think about accessibility practices and best practices, as you are creating sample code, can really help you really create robust sample code that can be viewed by people from a wide variety of backgrounds. And, if you do focus on accessibility, making sure that your code is readable, that you're using, all of the best practices from Ally and things like that too. So really be sure to, consider that as you are creating sample code. Also being open to feedback, from peer reviews to community feedback to feedback, as people are like, I often look up tweets about some of my code samples and things like that. I'm also active on the Twitter community, on developer forums, and seeing, how people are using my code and asking questions and things like that, especially code samples that I built, has been really humbling. And so just being open to that feedback and being able to change and adapt and, do things differently and changing your processes based on the feedback that you're hearing is something that's, really helpful. So be sure to be open to feedback. And on that note, we have lots of feedback channels at Twitter. And so if you are building with the Twitter API and there are things you want to see, if there's resources you want to see, we have a feedback channel, Twitter devfeedback.uservoice.com. You can leave us feedback as you're building with the Twitter API. There's feature requests. One example that is code sample related, is when we first released our labs code, we didn't have a Node.js sample, and very quickly someone let us know. They're like, hey, I want to see a Node.js sample, and then we added it like about 2 to 3 weeks later. So let us know what you want to see. This is one channel that you can do that as well. And there are some additional ways to give us feedback on our code samples as well. There is an issue tab in our GitHub repositories for our code samples. Feel free to, let us know if things aren't working, if you get stuck. There's also documentation feedback as well. We also have the Twitter community forums as well, but you can give specific documentation feedback at the bottom of every documentation page. There's a happy face or a sad face. And if you click on the sad face, you can let us know what's going on, especially if the code isn't working. Please let us know. We want to know. And so, as we are moving towards future launches, we're really trying to make sure that, we're building code-related resources that are as robust as possible. And we're really learning from mistakes we've made in the past and trying to build more code samples and, fully functional applications and glitch and things like that too. So, really kind of learning from what we've done in the past as we move towards new code samples as we're rebuilding the future of the API. It's been really exciting to be part of that process. And so, we've been recently kind of looking at some of our older sample code and rebuilding it and making it leaner and really making it more readable. And, that's been a really fun process. I was working with a coworker of mine recently, and, they were really good because they were calling me out when I was using single letter variable names and things like that. And so it's been really fun, to learn from some of the things we've done in the past and really, try to create really great sample code as we move towards future launches. And again, feel free to take a look at our code samples, github.com/twitterdev. And please let me know if you are inspired to build anything from this talk. Love to talk to you about code that you're building, things like that. At Jessica Garson is my Twitter handle. I briefly mentioned the Twitter community forums, but you can also let us know on the Twitter community forums at TwitterDev or at twittercommunity.com. If you're having issues with any of our sample code, if you have ideas for resources we can create, if you want to talk to us about sample code that you're working on as a team or ways to collaborate more together, we'd love to hear from you as well, especially if you're building on the platform. I'd love to have a conversation with you. And here are all the links that I mentioned. T.co is our internal link shortener. So t.co/labs, t.co/labstocks, twitterdevfeedback.uservoice.com, github.com/twitterdev, and twittercommunity.com. That is our Twitter community forums. Thank you so much, and hope you had a great day and enjoyed this talk. Thanks again for having me at Write the Docs. So excited to be able to participate. So thanks so much. Take care.